Hello and welcome everyone. My name's Anna Howard. I'm the Manager of Open Circle at the Centre for Innovative Justice. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're presenting from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thanks for turning up or tuning in to this event. It's been really amazing to see people register from far and wide, as far afield as the US, to learn a little about restorative justice and Open Circle's view of how it can complement the justice system. This event is being recorded and we'll be providing a link to the recording to anyone who has registered. Today I'm joined by some of my Open Circle colleagues. Stan Winford is an Associate Director at the Centre for Innovative Justice. Stan is a practicing lawyer and justice system expert with experience in innovation and reform, including user-centred design and applications for restorative and therapeutic justice in criminal and civil law. Stan's RJ work has included leading projects exploring the role that RJ might play in responding to harm and conflict in the context of serious crime, as well as workers' compensation, occupational health and safety and transport accident compensation schemes. I'd also like to introduce you to Renee Handsaker, who's the Principal Convener at Open Circle. Renee is a highly skilled facilitator specialising in restorative justice conferencing, conflict transformation and debriefing following traumatic events. Renee is an expert advisor to the Commonwealth Ombudsman's Office to assist with the development and delivery of the Australian Defence Force's Restorative Engagement Program, where she's facilitated restorative conferences between victims of abuse, bullying and harassment and senior representatives of the Australian Defence Force. Renee was also the principal facilitator for the CIJ's pilot restorative justice program for people involved in serious motor vehicle accidents. And I have a background as a lawyer and a manager, and I've worked across a range of justice reform programs and projects at the CIJ over the past 4 or so years. The way that today is going to run is I'm going to give a bit of an overview of what restorative justice is. I'll hand over to Stan, who'll talk a little about restorative practices and also about the sort of things that restorative justice can do in terms of meeting people's justice needs. I'll then talk a little about Open Circle and the kind of services it offers. And then I will hand over to Renee, who will take you into a little more detail of the restorative justice conferencing process and stages, and also share with you some a case study in depth of a matter that we have been involved in. And then we'll open to Q&A, and the way that you can ask questions, and we encourage you to do so, is to type them into the little Q&A icon on your screen, and we'll endeavour to get to as many of them as time allows. Okay, so restorative justice is a way of responding to harm or wrongdoing that focuses on the harm caused to people rather than a violation of laws, and sometimes we find it useful to think about it in contrast to the traditional justice system. So where the traditional justice system might ask what law has been broken, who broke that law and what does that person deserve, restorative justice instead asks who has been hurt, what are their needs, who has obligations to meet these needs, and what process is appropriate for stakeholders to respond to those needs and obligations. So restorative justice, often called RJ, is based on a belief that the people most affected by harm ought to be actively involved in resolving it and addressing its negative consequences. Restorative justice engages the people most affected by harm to talk about what happened, how people were impacted, and to come to an understanding about how that harm can be repaired or addressed. It offers benefits to all people who've been impacted by the harm, victims or the people harmed, offenders or people responsible for the harm, but also the broader community by meeting needs that are often not capable of being met by the traditional justice system. So a restorative justice conference is one process that's used, and that's the process that we commonly use at Open Circle, and that involves the people most impacted by harm being brought together in a conference or a conference process. And in that process, participants can share their experiences, their feelings, they can ask questions, find out more information, and together identify ways to repair and address the harm. So the participants, as I mentioned, can include victims or people harmed, offenders or people responsible for causing harm and their supporters, and it can involve other community members as well. Importantly, it includes a convener, so a neutral person who facilitates and makes sure the process is safe, respectful and fair for everyone involved. And Renee is one of our conveners. We've also got another convener at Open Circle called Asha Sweder, who couldn't be here today. So I'm going to hand over to Stan now, who's going to talk a little bit about restorative justice and restorative practices.
Thanks very much, Anna. This slide's really a note on terminology, and it's an interesting area to think about because the words restorative are used so frequently, and restorative justice is a word that's used, and restorative practices are words that are used very commonly too. That's probably because restorative justice can be found in principles, in processes, in practices, and in programs. A common practice of restorative justice is restorative justice conferencing. An example of a program involving restorative justice is the Centre for Innovative Justice's Culpable Driving Pilot Program, which we conducted over a few years recently. Restorative practices seek to strengthen and build communities and relationships, and I sort of think of them in some ways as preventing harm. By contrast, restorative justice processes like restorative justice conferencing are a response to harm. They occur in the aftermath of harm rather than as a way of building and strengthening relationships or reducing conflict. So restorative justice rather than restorative practices is usually seen as a complementary process to a conventional justice response. An example again is restorative justice conferencing between victims and offenders who may have been involved in a criminal justice process like a trial. In our own work at the Centre for Innovative Justice, we've explored restorative practices as well as restorative justice conferencing. For example, we've undertaken work for the Transport Accident Commission. That's an example of where there's a process which is provided for transport accident victims who can seek compensation and they can seek medical treatment as a result of their transport accident. But if they have what we would call justice needs, that process doesn't really respond to them. For example, people who've been injured in a transport accident often want to know what happened to the other person involved, or if they feel that the other person was at fault, they might want an apology from that person, or at least some kind of an expression from them of their regret about what's occurred. But in the Transport Accident Commission process, it's a no-fault scheme. It doesn't really matter who's at fault, and that's not something that people involved in the scheme or in administering the scheme are ever talking to people participating in the scheme about. So there is an unmet need that people have if there hasn't been a response to what they feel is a sense of injustice that's occurred. Other work we've been involved in has been for WorkSafe, which has two functions, one of which is prosecuting employers for occupational health and safety breaches. So it's almost a criminal justice process. And then there's their own compensation scheme, WorkCover, which responds to incidents or other types of injuries in the workplace that involve a compensation process. And in that compensation process, people often feel harmed through the process, and we've enabled a response to be developed that would respond to that harm. So that's a restorative justice process. Other work we've been involved in is for the university that we work for, RMIT, and developing a response to campus sexual assault, which sometimes goes unreported, which is sometimes ineffectively addressed, and leaves victims wanting some kind of response, which this type of process might be able to deliver. There are other examples of restorative justice practices, and they occur nationally and internationally, and both in the case of responses to harm or conflict, and sometimes as a framework to prevent harm from occurring in the first place. There's a lot of restorative practice happening in our education system. It's often used in schools to respond to bullying and other conflict, and sometimes to student discipline. In New Zealand, there's a really interesting project occurring at the moment, which is responding to harms associated with surgical mesh injuries, medical injuries, and restorative responses have been developed to enact listening circles so that people harmed can tell their stories in a way that existing conventional processes, such as complaints to health commissioners or civil litigation in relation to personal injury, haven't been able to meet those needs. Interestingly, in the UK, and some interest here as well, forensic mental health and mental health settings have seen an exploration of restorative justice processes in relation to patient assault or conflict, and in relation to other types of issues where, for example, a person may have been found not guilty by reason of mental impairment, leaving some victims and their families feeling as though justice hasn't been served, providing them with a response which enables them to talk about the impact of the harm and what they're looking for as a response. Restorative justice has also been used in prisons in relation to conflict and harm that occurs within prisons, between prisoners and prisoners and staff, and conventional restorative processes, for example, in the UK and indeed in our culpable driving pilot program, have involved restorative justice conferences held within prisons between victims and prisoners. Thanks. Can I have the next slide, please? I think it's the previous slide with the, thank you. A really useful way of thinking about what restorative justice is and what it's responding to is the notion of justice needs. Justice needs is an idea that scholars such as Kathleen Daly have developed as a way of understanding what victims are missing out on and what they've been looking for after they've been harmed. In the case of Kathleen Daly, she's often been researching the experiences of sexual assault victims. And she found very interestingly that even when people had been prosecuted in relation to those sexual offences, victims still had a sense of injustice and still had a sense that despite the conventional process that had been offered through the criminal trial, often leading to a conviction and so on, that there was still something missing for them. There was still something that they had not obtained, something that they were looking for. And restorative justice often can be seen as a way of meeting the needs of victims, the justice needs of victims, in ways that a conventional justice process may not. I think restorative justice isn't necessarily a replacement for a criminal trial, but it serves different purposes and different needs. And the way that we see it and the way our work engages with these concepts is generally to see restorative justice as a complementary process that might run alongside or as an adjunct to whatever it is that conventional processes are delivering for and need to achieve the functions that they need to deliver, for example, to ensure that people who commit offences are, convicted and receive their just deserts or their just punishment. In many ways, restorative justice processes are capable of meeting needs that people impacted by harm or other crime might not be able to find within the justice system or the conventional justice system. And examples of the needs you can see on the slide there are voice, validation, accountability, restoring relationships, information and prevention. I'm not going to describe all of these in great detail, but just pick out a couple which might illustrate what I'm talking about. So the idea of voice, which is in the top left-hand corner of the slide there, is really partly about participation. So in the example of the sexual offence trials that Daly looked at, many victims felt almost excluded from participating in those trials. They felt that this was a process that was occurring not really for them, not with their participation. And we can understand why that might be, because when a criminal trial takes place, a victim is often no more than a witness, and a victim may have little say in what's occurring. If a victim is not required to give evidence, for example, because a person pleads guilty, as is often the case in many trials, they won't have an opportunity to speak directly to the offender or to the court about what's occurred and the impact on them. So that sense of voice is about participation. That's something that a restorative process can offer and a criminal trial doesn't. Information is another very, very important restorative justice need that people have in the aftermath of crime or other types of harm. Criminal trials are looking at whether or not a person is guilty or innocent, or not innocent, whether or not they're guilty or can be proved to be guilty beyond reasonable doubt. And they relate to very specific evidentiary burdens. They relate to very important procedural fairness principles, such as the right against self-incrimination and so on. And all of those important processes and functions of a criminal trial can mean that questions that victims have about what's occurred when they've been harmed, or what the person involved was thinking, or why they did it, or even sort of circumstances of what occurred that might not be relevant for a criminal trial in terms of proving elements of the offence, that those questions that they have just aren't often answered in a criminal trial. And afterwards, despite perhaps someone being convicted and despite perhaps them being sentenced to a term of imprisonment or to some other sentence, victims are left feeling somewhat bereft, that there hasn't been a response that has met their need to know more about what occurred. Another very, very interesting justice need that's been identified, and something that's come up very commonly for us in the work that we've been doing, is the notion of prevention. It's the idea that despite something terrible happening, someone being killed, someone being injured, despite some other awful crime with significant impact, often victims talk about the potential for something positive to come out of this. So restorative justice, unlike a criminal trial, really may be flexible enough and specific enough to people involved in their needs to be able to generate preventive responses. For example, in one restorative justice process that we ran as part of our culpable driving process, which involved the death of two people, we brought the parents of those two people together, and one of the people who died, it came out, had not received adequate treatment for his mental health issues in the community. And as a result of that encounter between the parents of the person who killed one of the people and the parents of the person who'd been killed, both of those parents came together to advocate for mental health reform. And for them, it was a positive outcome and something that a conventional process would not have delivered, because it would have delivered perhaps the sentence for the accused person if they were convicted, or if they were found not guilty by reason of mental impairment, or if there was insufficient evidence, they really wouldn't have got anything like that, or the potential for anything like that out of that process. So you can see restorative justice can provide greater satisfaction for victims and people harmed in a criminal justice process. It can also provide increased accountability for people responsible for harm by requiring them to account for what's occurred in a much more direct way than through their lawyers in a criminal trial process. And the research also shows that to a significant degree, although not completely, it can reduce recidivism in offenders or people responsible for harm. And the figures in relation to satisfaction for victims of that process are very, very significant, so very high rates of satisfaction. I'll just have the next slide if I could. People ask often, why do people who've been harmed or victims want to participate in processes like this? These slides are from another one of the conferences that we've conducted from the participants, and they speak to those reasons. People participate because they want to tell their story in their own way to the person who's responsible for the harm or to other significant people. Again, they may not have had that opportunity. Criminal trial processes require particular stories to be told, and often to be told by people representing victims and people participating. So an opportunity to tell your story is a really important aspect of what restorative processes can deliver. Often people involved in incidents of harm as victims really want to know why that harm's occurred, and they want to know more about the person who's been involved. So they want to have the chance to ask questions, which is something that the trial process doesn't offer them, to find out more about the person who's harmed them, and to effect that prevention need to work with other people, perhaps including the victim offender, to reduce the chance of that harm happening in the future. So even if something terrible's happened to them or to their families, they want to see that that won't happen to someone else in the future. Why would offenders participate in something like this? Why would people responsible for causing harm want to take part? Well, again, interestingly, we find that, and the research suggests this too, that people who've caused harm have equally strong needs for justice that are not often met in a conventional process. They often want to know what the impact has been on the person that they've harmed, and they often have a very strong desire to acknowledge responsibility, or to offer an apology, or to prevent harm by doing something for themselves or in relation to their own conduct in the future. And again, why is this so strong? Well, one of the reasons is that there hasn't been any forum or dialogue opportunities for them within which those needs can be met. So I think this really shows that restorative justice has significant benefits for both people who've been harmed and for those who've harmed them, and it's worth, and we think worth, making it more available to people who've been harmed, particularly in our jurisdiction, where at the moment it's really only one ongoing program which only addresses people who've been harmed by young offenders. Thanks.
Thanks, Stan. I'd like to tell you a little now about Open Circle, the way we work. So Open Circle was launched in October 2019, following the launch of the Centre for Innovative Justice's Restorative Justice Culpable Driving Report. Of course, we're connected to the Centre for Innovative Justice and RMIT, and we're located here at RMIT University. And there are two key services that Open Circle offers. The first is a service providing access to restorative justice conferencing for people affected by crime or other harms. And the second is helping organisations or government departments designing restorative justice solutions that respond to their needs and those of their clients and service users. You can see up on the screen there Open Circle's principles, and I'll just take you through those. So the first is that we're accessible. That means that we're actually free. Participants don't have to pay to access our service. We're voluntary, So people only take part if they want to. You know, that's a fundamental principle of restorative justice. We're confidential, so people, what's said during the conference process is confidential, and the carve out to that is if everyone who participates agrees to waive that confidentiality, and an example is the case study that Renee is going to take you through shortly. Supported, so program staff spend time with each participant in the lead up to a conference. Beneficial, the process offers benefits to all participants in the conference, so not just one party over another. It's safe, so care is taken, a lot of care is taken to ensure that no one is harmed in participating. And flexibility, so as much as possible the process is responsive to people's needs. In terms of the kinds of matters that Open Circle accepts, our parameters are pretty broad. We'll accept referrals from victims and offenders, or people harmed, people responsible for causing harm, and their support workers, family members, friends, in matters where there's crimes committed by people 18 years and older, so not young people. There's another program responding in that area. And we don't accept referrals in family violence matters either. There's a dedicated service for those kinds of matters. We do accept referrals for traffic collisions, whether or not criminal charges have been laid, workplace harms, institutional harms. And so, you know, you can see that the kinds of matters that we accept are quite broad, and there's lots of examples that Stan touched on internationally and nationally as well, that we are open to looking at. So I'd now like to hand over to Renee, who's going to talk to you in a little more detail about Open Circle's practices and the stages of restorative justice conferencing. Over to you, Renee. You might have to unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you're good to go now.
Sorry, I just dropped out there for a second. Hi everyone, thanks Anna and Stan. So it's my job today, I suppose, to bring these concepts and restorative processes to life a little more, and I suppose in some ways to just demystify them a little bit. So you can see on the slide there, we've broken a restorative justice conference or process up into stages. So we've got stage one where an incident of harm occurs. The next stage would be that a referral would be made to our service, and we would engage in initial sort of intake discussions. So as Anna mentioned, either party can refer, or a support worker. And in that initial discussions, we'll talk quite a bit about people's hopes, concerns, worries for the conference. Once we have agreement that everyone wants to take part, we'll move into a preparation stage. So that preparation stage can take anywhere from, say, 1 to 2 months to even 6 months. And so we take a lot of care in the preparation just to make sure it's safe and that everyone is prepared and ready, I suppose, to take part. So it's once everyone agrees that they feel ready and are clear about what they want the conference to be and how they want that to look, we'll move to bringing people together. That's where the conference will take place, and then following that we'll have a post-conference. So there'll always be follow-up debriefing with every participant following the conference. So I suppose it's a key idea that underpins our work and our practice that the people closest to the problem will be the ones closest to the solution. So as much as possible at each of these stages, we're trying to give these experiences of harm back to the owners of it. And as I suppose we've talked about, that's in contrast to the criminal justice system that takes the conflict out of people's hands and makes decisions about what's required on behalf of people. So what that means is that each of these stages we try to be very flexible, dependent on the needs and the wishes of participants. And that's why it can also take quite a bit of time depending on where people are at and their readiness to take part. So today I'm going to take you through a case study. And this conference, it took place between two people named Hayden and Lindy. And this process took roughly 1 to 2 months to complete from start to finish. Now, I do want to acknowledge that that perhaps some of you tuned in today came to our launch of our service towards the end of last year, and so some of you might have heard this content already. But we have chosen this one to present on today just because we have the permission of the people involved, and yeah, we have their consent to talk about this. So hopefully there will be some new information for some of you too. So, okay, so you can see we have a nice Herald Sun headline there, which of course, as we know, only tells a singular story of the event. So Hayden was driving back from the pub in rural Victoria. He had drunk more than the legal limit of alcohol and was found to be travelling at almost double the speed limit. He lost control of the car, veered onto the wrong side of the road and collided with an oncoming car. And that car was driven by Ian, who died in the collision. Hayden was sentenced to 6 years and 4 months in prison. So Lindy, Ian's sister, contacted us as she heard about the pilot program, and Lindy was interested in a restorative justice process for a couple of reasons. So firstly, she knew it was something that her brother Ian would have wanted her to do. And secondly, she wanted to make sure that Hayden really understood the grave impact of his actions, really understood the consequences, and that in understanding the consequences, that would help his commitment to doing things differently in the future. So she had a really strong prevention need going in, that she could make a difference to him not repeating this behaviour. So from that point, we contacted Hayden to participate, and he agreed. So we just go to the next slide. So we're moving into, just so you can see here, we'll move into the preparation stage. So as I said, we have a lot of preparation conversations with everyone participating, and that is really about, we spend a lot of time with people around what are your hopes for the meeting? What are you worried about? What are you most concerned about? What do you most want to say to the other person? And importantly, how do you want to say that? Who do you want to be involved, and why is that important? So we consider these preparation conversations to be practices of building safety for participants, and also, I think importantly, practices of capacity building, so that what we're doing in these conversations is we're connecting people to their own skills and knowledge that they bring to responding to these situations. So for Hayden and Lindy, these preparation conversations, they covered a lot of ground, and today I'm just going to give you a tiny snapshot of some of the things. So for Hayden, he was really concerned that due to his anxiety and nerves, his mind and body would just completely shut down, especially when he was sitting across from Lindy. And so these preparation conversations, we worked through a plan with Hayden as to what was he going to do if this happened, and what would he want us to do, and how could we respond and overcome that. So one of the strategies for this is that we agreed that he would write Lindy a letter to be able to pass over at the conference if his words failed him on the day. And with Hayden's permission, we also relayed to Lindy in the preparation conversations with her that this was Hayden's fear, and that he wanted her to know that if this happened, it didn't mean that he didn't care or that he didn't have anything to say. So that was important for Lindy to be interpreting him correctly. So this is also part of our role in the preparation, is increasing people's knowledge and understanding of each other prior to coming together. And for Lindy, in our preparation conversations, we talked quite a bit about how she wanted to speak for her brother and honour him in this process. So we had a lot of discussion about who Ian was and how Lindy could go into this process and represent Ian's values, what would be important to him, and how she could carry him with her in this process. So in terms of the next stage, actually bringing them together into the conference. So we met in the prison. Both Lindy and Hayden were clear that they didn't want anyone else involved in this process. So Hayden actually did choose to have a support person who was a staff member at the prison. But Lindy was clear that she didn't want any other family members there, that they just wanted it to be between Hayden and Lindy. So it was at least a couple of hours, I would say. They had quite a robust, honest and thoughtful conversation. So Lindy was really concerned that Hayden would go back to his old ways upon release, and really pressed Hayden about what he was going to do differently when he was released and how this was going to be different. And something that was important to Lindy was also that Hayden would get to learn a bit about who her brother was, so who Ian was and the kind of person he was. And again, this was something that we'd negotiated in the preparation conversations, that this could be part of the conversation on the day. And so through the conference, we actually learnt quite a bit about Ian, and we learnt that he was incredibly community minded, that he volunteered at a local soup van, and that he left his estate to scholarships for disadvantaged young people. And so Hayden responded to this information on the day by suggesting to Lindy that whilst he knew he could never be a replacement for Ian, that he actually lived quite close to the soup van, and he wondered if he might volunteer there when he was released, and sought Lindy's permission for this. And this was something that Lindy really welcomed, and relayed to Hayden that actually she thought Ian would welcome this as well. So the other thing that Hayden suggested was that it was really important to him that Lindy knew he was serious about his commitments. And so he suggested that perhaps a way that he could stay accountable to Lindy and his promises was that upon release, every 6 months to 12 months, that Lindy and him would have contact, and he would update Lindy on how he was going. And so this was something that Lindy has agreed to as well. So post-conference, we had post-follow-up phone calls and debriefing, and part of this is I sent them both a list of questions, some reflection questions, just on their thoughts and ideas about the conference. So I've got some of these that I want to share with you today, and I think it's important because they're Hayden and Lindy's actual words. So I asked, why did you want to participate in a restorative justice process? Lindy says, anything to shift the feeling of being a bystander in the justice process. I did not want to see myself as a victim. I wanted to regain some control over the situation in a way that was more useful to me than the obvious response. Said it was the right thing to do. What was your goal in participating? Lindy says, I wanted him to take responsibility for what happened and not make excuses. And I also wanted to speak for my brother. Hayden says, to look Lindy in the eyes and say sorry. I know that will never bring her brother back, and I also wanted to show her I'm learning from my stuff-ups, and once out of jail, I'll stay on the right track. I ask, was there anything that surprised you throughout this process? And Lindy says, I was surprised at how personally rewarding it was. Hayden was frank, open, and took responsibility. I felt able to give back, not through forgiveness, but by letting him know that I had a stake in his future. And Hayden said, the biggest surprise would have been Lindy. She made me feel like a person and did not talk down to me. This let me open up a little, and I thank Lindy for that. And finally, what kind of difference, if any, has participating in this process made to your life? And Lindy says, I've been able to deal with some of the feelings and experiences that followed the death of my brother, the investigation and the trial. It has made me conscious of the value of this restorative justice process and the pitiful ways in which our prison system fails offenders and society. It has encouraged me to do what I can to draw attention to this. So just in terms of some of the outcomes, I suppose, from this process, that something that Lindy learned through this conference was that Hayden had actually not received any of the drug and alcohol treatments, despite being on all the waiting lists for his whole time in prison, his 4 years, and that this actually made him ineligible for parole. And so Lindy felt furious about learning this, and felt failed by the prison system, that they had wasted an opportunity to I suppose, contribute to Hayden and him doing things differently on the other side. So since learning this, Lindy has actually become quite a passionate advocate for prison reform and actually wrote to the parole board advocating for Hayden's release. And I suppose a postscript is that Hayden has now been released from prison, and Hayden and Lindy have kept to their promise and remain in contact. So we do actually have a little special treat at the end of this for anyone who wants to hang around. Following this conference, Lindy actually wrote a song about her experience and her reflection on it. And it's quite a moving song, and so we're going to play it at the end with the words for anyone who can hang around and join us for that. But I think we're going to throw to some questions now. Anna, is that right?
That's right, Renee. So a number of you have asked some questions, and so we're just making our way through those at the moment. And I will throw to the presenter that I think will be best able to answer the question that you've asked. So hopefully, Stan and Renee, you're ready and you can see those Q&As there. All right, so someone has asked a question, and I think it's a good one for right now, and that is, what are the implications for RJ operating in the COVID-19 environment of social distancing? And Heidi has mentioned that we have just written a blog that's been published. So Usha Sweeter, one of our conveners, has written a blog about this matter. But I'm wondering, Renee, if you could talk a little bit about how COVID-19's impacted or one particular matter we're involved in.
Yeah, sure. Look, it's a tricky one because like everyone, we've had to try and respond and be flexible in the way that we are responding. Sorry, can people hear me? Yep. Okay. Yeah, but unfortunately, I think there's also something about restorative justice where it's most powerful and most beneficial when people are in the same room, in the same physical presence to each other. And so I think there is something that is potentially lost if we are having to do these processes over Zoom or online. Yeah, so it's a bit of a mix at the moment. Is we are continuing to do our preparation sessions with individual participants over online. However, we have had some matters that we have had to put on hold, unfortunately, and that is because also the participants wanted to put it on hold until they could come together face to face, until restrictions are reviewed and changed. So, which is completely understandable, but it is disappointing because I think there is something about these processes that when people are in them, they have a certain momentum to them, and so having to, you know, when you're ready and you're prepared to meet with each other, it's really it's very difficult to actually postpone that, but that is what we've had to do in some of the matters due to COVID.
Thanks, Renee. So there's another question here that asks, is the goal of CIJ's restorative justice aimed at providing an alternative to the criminal justice approach, i.e. to decrease the number of people incarcerated, or is the CIJ providing a service that better responds to victims' needs? So maybe Stan, you'd be able to respond to that question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Anna. I don't think we're aiming at providing an alternative to justice processes in order to decrease incarceration. I think that would be restorative justice as an alternative or as a diversionary process. What we've sort of tried to do is to offer restorative justice as a complementary process for victims and indeed for offenders to respond to the needs that both experience in the aftermath of what's occurred. So some of the conferences that we've done have occurred post-sentence. So someone's serving a sentence and the victim in their case needs to know more about what occurred, a bit like the Hayden and Lindy type of situation. So I think, yeah, look, we see it primarily as a complementary process that offers something different from a criminal trial process. And it's important to remember that there are many cases where, although someone's been harmed, what's occurred does not meet legal definitions of an offence occurring. So there are also cases where, but for a restorative process, there wouldn't be anything on offer for victims. And in some cases, there's some really good examples of that. For example, in relation to historic sexual offending, some victims are not interested in a criminal trial process, and in other cases, there's simply such significant rates of attrition that that really a criminal trial that results in a conviction is occurring in 1% of sexual assault cases. So we think it's a really valuable complementary process.
Thanks, Stan. Okay, so there is another question here that I can deal with. It's quite straightforward. It's asking, who initiates the contact with participants, and do you approach the offender first to see if they are willing to be involved in the process prior to engaging with victims? It's a good question. And the answer to that is it depends. So we would work closely with the referring person. So it is sometimes the case, or often the case, that a person, a professional person who is supporting someone makes contact with our service. And sometimes they just want to, have a secondary consult, I suppose, to, maybe they're getting signs that a person might benefit from a process like this, and they just want to ask some questions of us about the process before they recommend it to the person that they're working with. And so often that's where it starts, with that conversation between us and the professional support person. And in that conversation, we would talk through those things about whether or not we, the person, that the support person thinks that it's best to ask or approach the offender if the person they're working with is a victim or person harmed, or whether or not, it's best to have the conversation first with the person harmed. So, that is an indication, I suppose, of the need of our service to be flexible and also to work really closely hand in glove with the other referring agencies or people who are supporting people who've been harmed or people responsible for causing harm. So yeah, our details are provided on lots of the slides, but the best thing to do is to give us a call, and we will be responsive to the needs of the individuals. So another question that we have is, so if a judge or magistrate upon a plea or finding of guilt felt that conferencing might be most helpful prior to sentencing, how could that come about? Stan, I'm wondering if you would be able to tackle that?
Sure, yep. Well, I guess in a sense it could come about by referral being made to our Open Circle program, which the details of which will be up on a slide at the end, and you can also see them through our website, cij.org.au. But it's quite a common thing for restorative conferencing to take place post-plea pre-sentence, and in fact that's the process in which it occurs in the Victorian youth conferencing system, in the youth justice context in Victoria. And I think many magistrates and judges would find a conference quite effective at identifying some of the things that they need to know about for the purposes of sentencing, such as whether or not an offender has expressed remorse and the impact of the offending on the victim. I suppose one thing to note, though, is in Victoria, we don't actually have a legislative framework for that to occur. And one of the things that we've suggested in our culpable driving pilot report, which you can find on our website, is that it would be helpful to have some clearer direction for the courts about the use of restorative justice in this type of context, which is the case in the ACT in Australia, for example. So, yes, it can occur and could occur, and in fact we've had a couple of referrals where it has almost occurred, but for various fines, and judges in those cases have said this looks like a good program, would be useful, but for various reasons participants decided that it wasn't for them at that time. So yeah, pretty simple process. Just get in touch with us.
Thanks, Stan. We've got a question here. How do you work with clients in regional areas? And I can respond to that one. So first thing to say is that actually lots of the clients that we had during the pilot program were in regional areas, and we you know, obviously through this time it's a challenge working with anyone wherever they are, but it's probably meant that our familiarity with video conferencing and other ways of engaging with people has meant that we can at least have some sort of initial conversations quite easily with people in regional areas. But other than that, we get in our cars and we go out and meet with them. And some of the conferences have actually been conducted in regional areas. Some people have been in regional prisons, and so conferences have had to occur there. So we're more than happy to speak to people who have clients or who are located in regional areas. There is another question asking us to touch on the effectiveness of restorative justice when there is an obvious power imbalance between the victim and the offender. And I might throw to Renee, our experienced convener, to deal with this one.
Thank you. Great question, and a really important question, I think, and sometimes one that's not talked about enough, I think, in this work. So, look, there's not a nice, neat, easy answer, but I suppose our position would be that there are relationships of power in every relationship, in every interaction, and that is sometimes more complex than just a victim and offender. That they're, you know, that there are relationships of power with gender, if someone's currently incarcerated, privilege, those sorts of things. So all of these sort of operations of power will be playing out at any different point. So I think in terms of a process, it's about being curious about what are these power imbalances that could be operating and how might they play out. It's about naming it with the participants, making it visible so that it, you know, when things are visible to participants, then we can make choices about them. Yeah, so staying curious and open to when they're at play and when they're taking over, and then having an agreement with all the participants about what will we do if that happens and how we will do that. So yeah, I don't know if that quite answers it, but that's my answer.
Thanks, Renee.
But I think it's a really good question, and I'm really happy whoever published that to keep chatting about those sorts of things with anyone who's interested, because I think the more we talk about it, the better that we'll get at it.
On a different, but you know, in a way related vein, there's a question about from someone who works with families that identify as Aboriginal. And the question asks, how is cultural safety managed when there may be a perpetrator who does not identify and a victim who does identify? So I'm assuming that means when there's a perpetrator who does not identify as being Aboriginal and a victim who does identify as being Aboriginal. How would we respond in a situation like that, Renee?
Sorry, I think I'm a bit confused about the question. So, sorry, can I just, so when the person who's done harm is Aboriginal and the person who hasn't done or who's experienced the harm is Aboriginal and identifies as Aboriginal, is that?
That's right.
And sorry, I can't see it.
The perpetrator does not identify as Aboriginal.
Look, I would say that there's something about that that would mean that I would get a secondary consult on making sure that we, I suppose, are being culturally safe in that I'm not Aboriginal, and so I would say that we would do secondary consults around something as, you know, around a dynamic that's as complex as that I wouldn't like to give you an answer about that because I'm not the most knowledgeable about that.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. And I think, look, there was another question, I suppose, that was asking about risk assessments. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through and trying to get to it, which I think here, is there a risk assessment component during the preparation stage that might involve certain circumstances that lead Open Circle to assess a matter as not appropriate for conference due to a possibility of causing harm to either party? So, yeah. I wonder, Renee, if you could just quickly talk to that.
Yeah, sure. Certainly that at each stage of the conference process, we're doing risk assessments to ensure that we're doing no further harm to the person who's done harm or the person who's experienced harm or any of the participants. So at any point, we will say that perhaps the conference is not ready to proceed at this time if we're concerned about anyone being harmed as a result of the process. So absolutely, there are times where a process either won't go through or that we will say perhaps we need to do a bit more kind of work, a bit more, and have a bit more time before it can go through so that we're clear and adhering to our principle of doing no further harm.
Thanks, Renee. Look, we're essentially at time. I'm wondering, we're going to flick to the lyrics of Lindy's song that she wrote after participating in the Restorative Justice Conference with Hayden. And we're going to try and play an audio clip. We'll see how that goes, Heidi. But I'd like to thank everyone for coming along. There was, you know, we were blown away by how many people were interested in participating in this webinar, and we think it's really reassuring that there's an appetite and an interest, an appetite for an interest in restorative justice. So thanks so much for listening. If you do have matters that you want to talk to us about, want to refer to us, then our contact details are on the slides that we will send out, and at the bottom of some of the slides you've already seen. All our processes start with a referral and a conversation, so we're here at the end of the phone to have that conversation with you, or at the other end of an email. So I hope you enjoy a lovely weekend. I hope the sun is shining wherever you are. It's not where I am, but have a lovely weekend, everyone. Thanks very much.
In the prison on a noonday morning, Luther always knew how this would feel. He'd taken a life and I lost my brother, so a meeting like this just couldn't be real. speak. So I offered my hand, and the pain in his eyes looked back at me. Do the crime, do the time, make them all toe the line and keep them locked away. Till the time is up, the time is up, the time. You said you must be bitter, you must be angry. Worthless kind of a man, you think you can shout, you can swear. I am guilty, I killed your brother through drugs and drink. I've done 4 years and I want to promise you I'll never do a thing like this again. But I can't help my 25 years of history, an honest promise might be in vain. Do the crime, do the time, make them all toe the line and keep them locked away. Till the time is up, the time is up, the time. I said I'm not bitter, I'm not angry. That won't change what happened that night. But a promise to me must never be broken. I know now you can tell wrong from right. You gotta quit the drugs like you've had to quit drinking. Soon you'll be out and on parole. Parole means word and word means promise. It's a way we can make our 2 lives whole. Do the crime, do the time, make them all toe the line and keep them locked away. Till the time is up, the time is up, the time. There's a big blank page, it's called the future, a life where you fill the blank page in. Be a father, raise your children, or stay back where this begins. I'm reminded talking to you that we are not worlds apart. Some bad choices lead to heartbreak, but the good ones give us heart. Do the crime, do the time, make them all toe the line and keep them locked away. Till the time is up, the time is up, the time. Till the time is up, the time is up, the time.